We are very pleased tonight to have a panel to talk about the Mayo Clinic and also about CVPH and miners' influence on rural healthcare here in the North Country. We would like to welcome Dr. Claude Deschamps, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the University of Vermont Medical Group. Dr. Deschamps is a thoracic surgeon at the University of Vermont Medical Center and a professor of cardiothoracic surgery and a senior associate dean for clinical affairs at the Larner College of Medicine at UVM in Burlington. He studied medicine at the University of Montreal. You are from Montreal originally.
I am.
You are. And you did your postdoctoral training at the Mayo Clinic. The thoracic and cardiovascular surgery, you were a thoracic and cardiovascular surgery resident in the late 1980s. You are a professor emeritus to this day for the Department of Surgery at the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine, and you were an assistant professor and professor in the Department of Surgery at the Mayo Clinic College from 1991 to 2013, and you were chair of the Department of Surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota from 2005 to 2013. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
We are also joined by Alan Adams, who since 2014 has been the director and curator at the Alice T. Miner Museum in Chazy. Prior to that, Ellen was an instructor in the Department of History at Saginaw Valley State University in Saginaw, Michigan, and also a teaching assistant at the College of William and Mary, where she earned her master's and PhD in history. Welcome. It's nice to have you. And also Dr. Richard Frost. Rich grew up in Glens Falls and practiced medicine for many years here in the North Country, attending medical school at Duke University and then his residency at the University of Kentucky. So you could ask Rich if he's a Blue Devils or Wildcats fan and get quite the story. Rich, of course, is also well known as an author and newspaper columnist for 25 years. Dr. Frost wrote a weekly regional travel column, A Day Away, for the Plattsburgh Press-Republican, which many of you remember. He also writes a historical column, Rich in History, for the Lake Champlain Weekly. Rich is also the author of several books on those getaways, and he has also written about the history of the Hotel Champlain and the former Plattsburgh Army and Air Force Base, the Plattsburgh Military Reservation, A Pictorial History, that he co-authored with Melissa Peck. And if you haven't read that, that's a great read. Rich, thank you very much for being with us as well.
Sure, thank you.
Dr. Deschamps, why don't we begin with you? You did your residency at the Mayo Clinic. You are the former chair of the Department of Surgery and continue to be a professor emeritus in the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. You have done much of your training and teaching at the Mayo Clinic. It has been a significant part of your professional training and life, and it must have special meaning to you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored and very happy to be here. And I was not quite sure how Ron found me to talk about the Mayo Clinic, but I said yes right away. And I don't know if the people sitting behind me saw that at every 5 minutes I was turning to Dina and telling her that I knew that person, the cardiac surgeon. Dr. Dorini is a friend of ours. He's the godfather. He was the godfather at confirmation for my daughter. And I named him as chair of cardiac surgery, as I was the leader in surgery overall. Maybe I'll take you back to 1981. If you can picture a boy from Montreal, doesn't speak much English, barely, worse than today. And I was doing my general surgery, and my boss in Montreal says, if you want to stay at Hotel Dieu, you got to go to the Mayo Clinic. And while I knew about the Mayo Clinic, many articles were written in our textbook, I really had no clue what this was. But I wanted to come back. I wanted to have training in surgery. And I was really fascinated by the United States. And so I went to apply for a fellowship, and 3 years later, I was on my way after completing my first fellowship in Montreal. I did 4-year research in cardiothoracic surgery. Came back at night, and really what the movie is slightly truncated and it's not all there, but it does capture the spirit. And I could speak for hours, so that would not be fair for my colleague here, and maybe boring for some of you. But when you see, I could speak about the cornfield. You come in Rochester, and Chris, the airport in Rochester is barely bigger. It was very small. 2 airlines at the time when I was a fellow in 1982, Republic Airline and American Airline. Then it became Northwest and then Delta, but still a small airport. But very busy with patients. Every day you could see at the airport patient coming with wheelchair and their x-rays under their arm before the time of the CD. But what I wanted to say is that you come in and you see cornfield, only cornfield. And then you realize that people don't go there or don't make the choice of living in Rochester for the mountain or the lakes. Minnesota, is as you probably know, is on the licenses, it says state of 10,000 lakes. Olmsted County, where the Mayo Clinic is the only county with no lake. and it is true, we lived in the wood the entire time, and stayed there 4 years, came back in Montreal, and at the time I was a widow, and it was easier for me to make life decisions by myself with my daughter, and remarried and returned to Rochester. They asked me back, and I was honored, and to me it was like the Walt Disney of medicine. And I said, well, why, I had been happy as a fellow. I thought I would be happy as a surgeon, and I was. Spent 23 years after this, and I was very happy as a clinical surgeon, then rose to the rank of responsibility on the board and became chair of surgery. That's a very short summary, but I can give you a couple of pearls. The sisters were truly the heart behind the Mayo Clinic. They really told Dr. Mayo, and I was telling this to, who was I? I was telling this tonight I think to you, Rich, that the Mayo brothers, the father Mayo has been told by his wife, if you travel once more, I'm not going with you. And he was examining soldiers for the Civil War. And he stayed, prompted after the tornado by Sister Mary. And what happened is that his son became physician, you saw the story, and he became a very successful clinic taking care of patients. And really to this day, the sisters are still there. It's called Assisiites, and they has permeated the life of many, many physicians in Rochester. My wife befriended several sisters. My wife is a rabid Catholic, and I am less rabid than she is. And very, very believing in the role that the sister took in the life of the city. And they actually babysat our children. We still have cards 5 years after we left of sisters that are still alive, because of course the sisters also are getting older. But Sister Generose, one of the sisters that you saw, was on the board for many years, and she actually showed a lot of courage in her leadership. When the Mayo Clinic made decisions that were controversial about female reproduction and having gynecologic surgery, the Catholic Hospital Association threw the Mayo Clinic out of the association because of that decision, and Sister decided to stick with the Mayo Clinic. Years later, the Catholic Hospital Association welcomed back Sister Generose, welcomed back the clinic, and apologized for the rigidity of their approach. At the end, everybody was friend. But it told you that Sister was thinking of the patients and not of nothing else. And there was an example of the dedication. I could go on, and I think only say that I was telling Dina, I was whispering to Dina, there was no contract between the sister and the Mayo Clinic. There was no contract between the Mayo Clinic and the physicians. I never had a contract for 23 years. So it was quite eye-opening coming to a different world where contracts are the norm. The rest of the country, contracts are the norm. How I'm going to be paid are the norm. The Mayo Clinic physicians are on a salary. Very good salary, very fair salary, but on a salary. So patients come in with at least the impression that the physician will see them with no personal interest in the treatment that they will give to those patients. And so to this day, they still don't have any contract. And the only things we signed in recent years is the conflict of interest, making sure that our relationship with industry were declared. But there was no contract, still no contract. I think I should stop there.
Well, that's fine. We're just getting rolling.
Yes, just getting warm.
Hope is at the foundation of the Mayo Clinic. It was an important piece of Mother Alfred's original vision, and in fact, it's still to this day part of the Mayo's mission statement to inspire hope while providing the best care to every patient. Is fostering that culture of hope one of the things that the Mayo Clinic does so well?
I'm going to have to continue. And I think you saw Dr. Noseworthy say it. Dr. Noseworthy was the CEO for the last 9 years, stepping down this year. He's a neurologist, led the Mayo Clinic across the country, and it is correct. It was oftentimes, not always, of course, and many patients came for conditions that you would call routine or something that were not as challenging. But for many patients, Rochester was also the end of the road, the place where many other places would have said, we don't know what's wrong with you, or we really don't take, we're willing to take the risk. And it was, for some reason, some people call it the magic sauce. Not everybody was, not everything was perfect, that's not what I imply, but we gave hope, the clinic gave hope to patients with the culture, the ethos. You know, it's not exactly hope only, but the dedication of the employee. You know, when I came in 1985, it was 45,000 people in town, which half of them were employed by the Mayo Clinic. When I left, 110,000 patients, which 40 in Rochester, 42,000 were employed in the Mayo Clinic. And where those people were very, very great, nice, generous, but ordinary people. They were the wife of the farmer that was working at a desk attendant to provide health insurance to the family, because the farmer could not do that. It was the nurse that always wanted to have a job in healthcare, but was from Rochester or from Minnesota, and all her family was in Minnesota. Why don't you work at the Mayo Clinic? And there's always a job somewhere eventually that you can get there. And just an example, my wife is a gynecologist and worked at the Mayo Clinic as well. And one day at noon, there was a patient that had been waiting for a CT scan for a few days. And they got a CT scan for her in the afternoon. The desk attendant called 9 hotels to find that patient so that she showed up to her CT scan. Nobody asked the desk attendant to do that, but there was no beeper, there was no way of reaching that patient and she didn't know which hotel. There's about 10,000 hotel rooms in Rochester. So she did that, and that was an example of the dedication, and there's countless examples. So the ethos of the place that give hope, the compassion, and it's not one thing. I think it's and of course there are people that have been, it's not a fairy tale for everything, everybody. But on the whole, I think it's a place and people that are in that place that are trying to give you that hope. And oftentimes it's working.
Thank you. We will let you have a drink of water. Rich and Ellen, clearly providing health care was important to William H. Minor. After many of his other accomplishments, more productive farming practices, hydropower, and the first centralized rural school, was good health care the next logical step? Did he want to help improve the quality of life for his hundreds of workers and for people living in the communities of the North Country?
somebody saw my name on the announcement that I was going to be on this panel. And of course, they asked me on the street the other day, did William Minor want to make this sort of like the Mayo Clinic? The truth is, I don't think he had any of that kind of aspiration. For William Minor, the whole issue was a problem that we're still talking about today. How do you keep young people from leaving a rural area? His kind of overlying philosophy that kind of unites everything except maybe the draft friction devices from which he made his fortune was, what do you do so that life here is just as good as in any city across the United States? And agriculture obviously was one thing. He was interested in scientific agriculture. I think his life dream was really the kind of building we're sitting in now, the Agricultural Institute. I wasn't here early enough to see the Chazy school before they tore it down. He clearly had commitment to local education. But I think to him, healthcare was just another part of what you have to do if you're going to encourage people to stay here after they've grown up and been educated, and also attract new people to come here. That's how we got interested in healthcare. Plattsburgh didn't have a hospital in 1900. Interestingly, there'd been a military base here forever from 1814, and the military base had two good hospitals built during that time period, one in 1890, and they decided to build another state-of-the-art one in 1896, but there was no civilian hospital. There had been epidemics like there were everywhere, and if there's one thing I think people forget, it's what epidemics did to this country before we had vaccines readily available. And after a really bad diphtheria epidemic here in the 1880s, newspapers wrote editorials on the need for a hospital. You know, it's interesting. I did write a history of Plattsburgh, and the one thing I'll tell you about writing history is never look for two sources to confirm each other, because as soon as you find the first source, the second source will tell you the opposite. So either the community approached the Grey Nuns and asked them to help build a hospital here, or the Grey Nuns came down from Ogdensburg and told Plattsburgh, you need a hospital. One of those two apparently was the case. There was a big public subscription drive, and in 1910, the hospital opened. It cost about $120,000 to build that hospital. It was about 110 beds. Some of you might think doctors are contentious these days, and doctors were probably more contentious then. A bunch of the doctors were upset because they weren't given a majority of the board of directors on that hospital, which was called Champlain Valley Hospital. Starting a hospital was a little bit easier in those days than it is now, and so they started their own hospital. They bought a building on Court Street. It was 3 stories. I'm told, but nobody will ever let me in to find out if it's true, that the top was skylit and the operating rooms were on the top floor. But they had a 30-bed hospital there, expanded it into a 60-bed hospital. That was Physicians Hospital. They had some dry times around World War I, and it was after World War I that Mr. Minor met Dr. Cassius Silver, who was his personal physician, as it said on as we saw tonight in the documentary. Dr. Silver, who actually was from Chattagay, I didn't know that until yesterday, but he was born in Chattagay, but he went off, like one of the Mayo sons, to the University of Michigan for his medical degree. He also crossed the Atlantic, did some study in Europe, and then came back to Plattsburgh and practiced in both hospitals. He's the one who told Mr. Minor, we really need a bigger hospital to really serve this region. And again, it depends on who you want to believe, but the Minors and the Silvers had dinner together at the Silvers' house in Plattsburgh in the early 1920s, and after dinner, walked around, and William Minor said to Alice, where should we put this hospital? And she pointed out a site on the outskirts of town, in the woods, up on the hill, and said, how about right there? The other newspaper I read this afternoon, which was the Sentinel instead of the Plattsburgh Press, said it was Dr. Silver's wife who did that. But like I've told you, and I'm not looking for the third source because I don't really want to know. So he bought 35 acres right there, and he started building a hospital. Those of you who have been around here a while know that if Mr. Minor builds, he builds it big and he builds it solid. And I can tell you, a lot of people may not know that all those pictures you were seeing up there, that hospital is still standing. You can cover it up, but it's very hard to get rid of. And I had a stint in senior management for a while in the 1990s when we were putting in a cancer center and expanding the emergency room and putting in the first MRI machine. and he wanted to knock one of those buildings down. The engineer said, "Don't bother, you're not going to be able to do it." And so people built around it again. Yeah, that hospital makes a statement. It's up on a hill. It doesn't seem like it's a hill to me, but I guess, you know, now that I look at the pictures, it was up a little bit on a hill. I think of the Puritans and their cities on the hill, and maybe that's what he wanted it to look like. I don't dare tell you what kind of construct or architectural type that is. To me, if I see columns, it's Greek Revival, and that's about as far as I can go. He had the columns, but then you walked into the lobby, and the lobby had a Howard Pyle painting, portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall, and it also had an original Peter Paul Rubens. We're not decorated quite the same right now, although it's still very nice. And it was a big deal, you know, you think about it, all these rooms, all private rooms. The thing that amazes me is every one of those rooms had a vestibule. There was an entryway because he thought that might keep the noise down for the patients. And I can tell you, it was another 100 years before anybody thought about whether noise would bother patients. But they had vestibules, they had all private bathrooms. There were plaques everywhere. He was big on finding adages from classic literature, and you still see those around the hospital. The lounges were the physicians and for the board, and even for the nurses, were like nothing. It's like a club room if you're in a private club. Probably like the surgical club that was in Rochester. I mean, it was all wooden mahogany. They all had fireplaces. All the fireplaces had plaques with adages on them, and I guess were appropriate to who was going to be using the room. I don't think he had to have known about the Mayo Clinic. Remember, he knew nothing about hospitals. That didn't faze him a bit. He knew nothing about schools when he built the school. He just told the architect that he hired, go out and learn about hospitals, so I'm sure he found out about the Mayo Clinic. You saw the observation room from which people could watch surgery at the Mayo Clinic. All the operating rooms at Physicians Hospital had these amphitheaters, much like what I saw in medical school. But I can tell you, I went to a big and busy medical school, and I never saw an amphitheater for 125 people up there to watch an operation, and that's what one of them had here. He was proud of the staff. There was a little bit of academics put into it. By 1929, they were having a summer school for fourth-year medical students who were invited from around the country to get some practical experience in what they then called, you'll love this term, cardionephritis was their, which means sort of the effect on the heart, on the kidney, and that was their specialty. But they also had Wednesday afternoon lectures with guest speakers from elsewhere, and they published the proceedings of all of this with both the lectures that were given to the students and the Wednesday afternoon series, and they also included in that book papers that physicians here did that presented elsewhere. So it's kind of interesting to see some names that I actually had heard about. He had one thing the Mayo Clinic didn't have, and I think this is important. He had a whole staff of Swedish masseurs available for the patients. And he felt that that was important enough that not only were they employed to give massages to the patients, but they were also to instruct the nursing school students as part of their physical therapy on the Swedish massage techniques. You can take that for what it's worth.
And Ellen, maybe I'll ask you, maybe that's a perfect example of where Miner spared no expense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think just to kind of place William Miner kind of into the broader historical context, I would note that during this time period, a lot of small cities were building hospitals, kind of in the same way that William Miner was building Physicians Hospital. It was kind of a way to show that your city was modern, scientific, progressive. It was something that people hoped would attract people to their city, so that people would want to live and work in these smaller cities because they had an institution like a modern hospital. And I think it's also important to remember that basically up until the turn of the century, people didn't go to hospitals. I mean, a hospital was a place that a poor person went kind of as their last resort. And if you had any means whatsoever, you would get all of your medical care at home. And so just the fact that they were building a hospital with private rooms with the expectations that kind of middle class and well-to-do people would actually be going to a hospital kind of signaled a real transformation in medical care. And obviously William Minor was kind of very much aware of those kind of larger developments. And kind of making kind of all these modern developments, like, you know, being able to get x-rays, being able to get surgeries of various kinds. I mean, those are all fairly new developments in the 1920s.
I was going to ask, did he have a lot of equipment at this hospital that other hospitals didn't have?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the specifics of it, but my understanding is that basically whatever was kind of the most innovative pieces of equipment that were available at the time, you know, that was what they had. You know, because again, they were kind of starting from scratch at this period when a lot of new techniques and devices were kind of first becoming available, and so he was able to kind of immediately apply all of that knowledge to the hospital.
And Rich, I don't know if you found in your research, did Charlie Mayo come here? Did he visit the hospital? Do we know when he said that it was the best equipped that he had ever seen, which is quite a compliment? Do we know if he physically came here and toured the hospital?
I'm going to have to say that I'm not aware of it. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I have not read about it. And actually, I've never read any definite reference in William Minor's work about the Mayo brothers or the Mayo family, the Mayo Clinic. The closest I came was I noticed in one of the Mayo Clinic, I had to read up a little bit on the Mayo Clinic this week, and one of their state-of-the-art hospitals they built, I want to say around 1918 or 1914, somewhere in there, they emphasized that the turnover on air exchange throughout the hospital could be done every 3 minutes. And I know that Mr. Minor put in his book, our air exchange can be completely done every 3 minutes. And that's the closest I came to a reference. But I'm not aware of Charlie Mayo
I
coming.
mean, as you noted, he did send the architect Frederick Townsend out kind of on a tour of hospitals around the United States. So I would have to assume that if he didn't visit the Mayo Clinic personally, he certainly must have been aware of it, you know, and certainly.
And
would
much
have applied
like
some of
his
those
other
ideas.
investments, William H. Minor oversaw the operation of the hospital.
Yes.
Obviously
Yes.
not medically, but just
But
about every
in
other.
in terms of the construction, and again, as you know, if you've seen the Paul Frederick's film, that was very typical of him, that he was a very hands-on manager, that he knew exactly how he wanted everything to be, and he would spare no time or expense in order to make sure that his kind of wishes were carried out. And as Rich was saying, you know, this was a building that was not just utilitarian, but it was also meant to be a kind of relaxing place where the environment would help patients recuperate. There would be a pleasant place for people to visit people who are in the hospital, and kind of creating this setting where the employees and the patients would kind of feel comfortable, almost as if they were in their own homes.
If you want to know what kind of a micromanager he was, he told them what kind of mattresses had to be on the beds. He told them how the crank on the bed had to be oriented for the patient to use. And he also was involved in decreeing what had to be done to keep the food warm enough or cold enough on up to a patient's room. So,
Did the hospital have a stellar reputation for its health care?
yeah, it's, you know, one of the things, a lot changed over the years right after that. We're talking about an era, when this hospital opened, there were no antibiotics. I mean, it's hard for me to come to grips with that, but there were no antibiotics.
And it opened January 1926.
Correct. And so, in fact, the first article in that symposium I was referring to was what they called serologic treatment of pneumococcal pneumonia, which was the most common bacterial pneumonia and was a very common cause of death. It's something, that bug is still sensitive to penicillin almost all the time, and they treated it by making sort of like vaccines. They would get antibodies that would be made against it and try to treat people that way. And the article said that they decreased the death rate from, I think it was, I'll get this wrong, but I think they decreased the fatality rate in the hospital from 33% to 20% with that kind of pneumonia with serum. So there was a lot going on. But I do think that the other thing you got to remember is Mr. Minor wasn't around long after that hospital was built.
That's the sad irony,
He,
yes.
he died in 1930. He was a patient at the hospital and died during an operation. And I think, you know, the hospital was bound to change. One of the things I didn't know until Joe Burke's biography came out is, unlike the philanthropists that I've always read about in that era, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and Julius Rosenwald, who I mentioned because he has a Plattsburgh link, but he was the other major, huge foundation. He was the CEO of Sears. These people had made their money and put it away into a foundation. Mr. Minor was funding everything out of what he was making, pretty much. He gave his patents to his foundation, and he had to do some structural changes in the way that the business and the foundation was run. And he did spend $4 million, which at that time was an enormous sum. In 1930, the year he died, he gave $243,000 to the hospital, presumably to cover deficits and other expenses. Within 2 years, that was cut down to $31,000. It was cut down by, you know, almost 90%. So he really didn't have a structure that was going to be conducive to the explosion of healthcare costs that is coming now, although I would say that the explosion that we've seen over the last 20 years is a challenge that nobody would have been ready for.
Yeah. And speaking of costs, Dr. Deschamps, at their practice at the hospital, the Mayos sought to provide care despite a patient's ability to pay.
So over time, this has evolved, and Mayo now, of course, provides care, and as is paid by insurance, paid by, you know, in cash, or paid by insurance, or sometimes by other means. But for a long time, they would disregard the ability to pay. And for physician, actually, there was a special treatment. And until the mid-'80s or the beginning of the '80s, any physician coming from the United States or even the world, I think, would have their treatment in Rochester, would not have to pay anything. And that, and the economic reality kicked in, and Mayo stopped extending those privileges. Mayo have always tried to be conscious of what they charge. You know, 85% of the Mayo patients come from the 5 surrounding states. Mayo is a destination medical center, and maybe 5% of their revenue come from the entire world and the rest of the country. But actually 85% of their patients come from the 5 surrounding states. And those 5 surrounding states are farmers, people that are blue collars, people that often have insurance, most of them do, but they are not a wealthy group of patients. And the 15%, 10% comes from the rest of the country, and less than 5% comes from overseas or South America or Central America. But there is, I think Mayo is conscious of, even today, of their role in terms of competing with other medical centers. This has changed, of course. You know, there was less, Mayo was less conscious of the fact that it had competition in the middle of the century. But as their position changed and their ranking for the U.S. World News Report became very important, they became aware of that they had competitor in St. Louis, in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in Chicago, New York, Houston, and even California. And that changed the landscape of the payers, the landscape of the economy of medicine. But Mayo has kept one thing real, is that they wanted to compete on value and not on volume. And they have re-examined decades after decades whether their physicians should be paid with a productivity clause or a salary that would recognize the number of hours they work. And every time they would examine this in a committee structure, because Mayo is ran with a very solid committee structure, that would be defeated and would be seen as a threat to the ethos, to the culture of taking care of patients, you know, with disregard to an extent of the economy.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions now. I am going to grab the mic and come and take questions from anyone who has one. If you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, I will come to you. Anyone have any questions? Jerry? Let me get to you, and you won't hear this. This is just for our purposes for recording.
I'd just like to ask what you two or three consider to be the biggest changes since Miner was there and today with the hospital. What has transformed the hospital since that time?
You want me to go first?
Sure.
I think there is several. The electronic medical record that happened in the 90s has changed the landscape of medicine to an extent, and doctors would tell you not necessarily for the best. It has threatened, it has helped many things in medicine to have a better hand on understanding, the flow of patients, the repository of medical data, having a lot of information at the fingertip for the practitioner. But the electronic medical record, which is in itself a revolution, has also distanced the patient from the doctor, have brought the doctor closer to the computer, and has increased the distance between the patient and his or her doctor. And so that has been probably one of the biggest changes. The technology has continued to progress from the beginning of the century to now. It is mind-boggling, it is fast, it is dizzying, but there are things that have happened in between. So I think the electronic medical record has been a blessing and a curse in some ways, and the clinic is aware of it. The clinic has started, the Mayo has started issuing research on burnout, and has been a leader in the country for physician and provider burnout and trying to address how to address it, how to prevent it, how to treat it. And one reason is because its physicians have worked hard, and it's an environment that maybe at times have disregarded the balance that maybe many of us cherish in terms of being able to have a family life that's reasonable and a career that is fulfilling. So that is one change that comes to mind. Physically, Rochester is unrecognizable almost from when I came in '85. I returned for funeral of a dear friend last spring, and it's now, there's about 75 buildings dispersed through the city. The clinic remains, of course, the top employer, but physically it has changed in many, many hotels, and it is becoming a destination medical center. So that is one of the big changes. And the self-consciousness, Rochester now is not the sole repository of the Mayo Clinic culture. There's Jacksonville, Scottsdale, and the Mayo Clinic health system in the 5 surrounding states. They have 20 hospitals, not the 2 hospitals that Rochester started, the Methodist and St. Mary's. Now the Mayo Clinic is 65,000 employees, and many, and this has changed the landscape. Now it's our country destination medical center, competing with Cleveland, MD Anderson, Sloan Kettering, and Kaiser to an extent. Charlie.
I'll certainly agree with the comments on the electronic medical record. There's definitely value to society in that my prescription stopped being handwritten, so therefore it could be read by somebody who was trying to fill them. But I will tell you, when you pick up a chart, it's very hard to piece together a patient's story. And when I was in medical school, they hammered into us that every patient's different. If you have 5 patients with pneumonia, don't think all 5 of them are going to be the same patient, even if they have the same bug causing the pneumonia. And I'm someone who went into medicine because I like talking to people one at a time and getting to know them. And a lot of that is being made more difficult in medicine. The technology is incredible. I mean, medical students today don't believe it, but I'm old enough to have had to practice without a CAT scanner. And so I actually had to go think about things and what sometimes I'd have to make the decision to call a surgeon and say, let's do exploratory surgery. It wasn't just sending somebody off for tests. You had to make life and death decisions, even in terms of being able to get to the next step. And then the introduction of laparoscopic surgery, and what the cardiologist can do is just incredible. But I will tell you, there's one part of healthcare that has changed, and it hasn't been for the best, and that is, I think it was inevitable, but it's just too expensive. And and I'm one of these people who thinks that there's got to be a system so that everybody can afford, you know, the vast majority of the health care that they need. And I had patients who just literally, I would know they had a bad disease and needed something done, and they would not be able to get it done. And that was bothersome to me. Medicine has become more of a business. And I don't know if there's anybody here who's any hospital boards, but I would suspect that more time is spent talking finances than it is, you know, a lot of the other things that we always had to talk about with patients. Some of it, again, is inevitable. It's an extraordinarily complicated enterprise, and when you hear the numbers that were spouted out in the documentary for how many physicians, how many lab tests, I mean, let me tell you, if there's one thing I wouldn't want to be, it's a CEO of a hospital. It's an extraordinarily complicated entity, but I don't want to see anything erode the basic relationship of a physician trying to take care of somebody and that patient, because that's really what we all went into it for, and what we want to continue doing. Now, granted, the science is much more complex, and I was very happy to have that documentary say that nobody can expect to know it all anymore. Because I have to say, there's lots of days where you think everybody does expect you to know it all, and it's just not possible. But for the most part, it's all very exciting, and I can tell you, even during a few decades, I moved from the point where if somebody 85 came into the office, we would talk about it for about 3 weeks afterwards. And by the time I left practice, I would see 3 people over 90 almost every day. And the technology and the medications that have been developed, and hopefully some of the excellent medical care, were factors in that.
So I'll just add to that, you know, in addition to obviously the technological changes, I think one really important development since the time of Physicians Hospital is the idea of health insurance. I mean, in 1926, health insurance as we understand it today didn't exist. And you could get various forms of employee compensation if you were in an accident at work, or kind of mutual benefit societies that might provide you with some assistance in the event of some sort of like catastrophic accident or illness. But the idea that kind of routine medical care, something that should be provided and accessible to people, was kind of a new idea. And it took a while for that to really kind of become sort of entrenched in people's minds as something that they could and should have access to. And obviously, it's still a very contentious issue.
Do we know if Miner provided health care coverage for his workers?
I actually do not know. My impression is that he was kind of the school that believed that this was something that kind of could be handled through basically private philanthropy. So if he knew that an employee had a medical problem and that they needed financial assistance, he would step in and pay for that. But in terms of kind of some overarching system that would provide everyone with kind of regular access to medical care, I don't think so.
Any other? Oh.
Yeah, one of the things he did, it had actually been done previously at the Champlain Valley Hospital. The last donation to build the first hospital, the predecessor of Physicians Hospital, the last donor to end the campaign for the $120,000 they needed was Loyal Smith, who was actually the other great philanthropist of this area, but that nobody's ever heard of. He also gave the money for Plattsburgh City Hall. He's also from Chazy, for that matter. I guess Chazy is a good place to be born if you want to go out west, make your fortune, and come back and do something. But he also, in giving the last $25,000, he also left a $200,000 endowment so that 5 beds could always go to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to pay for it. And if you look in Mr. Miner's publication, and there was nothing he liked to do besides build, his except maybe building. The thing he liked most is publishing things. And his catalog of the hospital lists 4 or 5 different groups that also endowed, or that supported beds. It was kind of an interesting concept to think. I mean, we wouldn't think about as providing a bed, but that's what they did. They underwrote the cost so that people who otherwise couldn't afford it would get the care. And he was committed to I think he was committed to the idea that everybody deserved to get care. Nobody was going to get thrown out.
Other questions? Yes. We'll come here and then go to the other side.
So this past weekend, I was at the I guess it's called Healthcare Trustees of New York State Conference in Saratoga, and learned that 18% of the CEOs in New York State are women. So that means that the remainder, 82%, are men. And when you looked at all the early Mayo pictures, all white males, and then Mayo's depiction now was quite a bit different because they had black physicians, they had female leaders and such. And I'm just, obviously things are changing, but I'm wondering, we aren't maybe there yet. Do you have any comments on the effects of maybe some diversity within the medical field?
I don't think that Mayo was more progressive than the rest of the leading institution in our country, except for the sisters. The sister had a prominent role in taking care of the patients and running the hospital. Sister Generos ran St. Mary's Hospital for many, many years as the head administrator. I was whispering to your ear again, Dr. Nelson, one of the female doctors that was shown there, was my successor as chair of the surgery. It would not have happened 10 years ago. And I think that Mayo, like other institutions, started doing things. For example, when I became chair of the surgery department, I had 1 or 2 female surgeons. When I left, there was 10 female surgeons, of whom 7 of their husbands were at home taking care, helping with the things that are necessary to take care at home. And this was an arrangement that worked for them. And this was a reflection of what was happening. So there is more diversity. Rochester is still a town that is lack diversity overall because of its geographic location. It has more immigration now from Minneapolis, where there is more Somali people coming because of the war, and more Hmong people coming because of the Vietnam War as well. And there has been immigration from Chicago, from the African American community, because of the social and economic challenges of Chicago and Illinois. So all of those things are happening in Rochester, not at a terrible fast pace.
Considering Physicians Hospital was partly started because physicians wanted more seats on the board of directors, I found it interesting that in 1929, Physicians Hospital had about a 20-person board of directors. It's not exactly 20, I didn't count it. But only 3 were doctors. But the thing that's interesting, they also had 3 women. So there were as many women as there were doctors. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Yeah. I mean, Alice Miner herself served on the board of Physicians Hospital for many years after William Miner's death. And another interesting thing that I think maybe not a lot of people are aware of was that William Miner's sister actually was a physician. She was actually also a graduate of the University of Michigan's medical school. She graduated in 1901. And she has a really interesting story. She was widowed when she was in her early 40s and was looking for a way to support herself and her children, and began taking classes at Purdue University in Lafayette, Indiana, where she lived, and thought maybe she'd become a nurse or maybe a pharmacist, but discovered kind of as she was taking these classes that she really had an interest and an aptitude for medicine, and decided to pursue a medical degree. So that was still fairly unusual in the late 1890s for a woman, especially one of advanced age, to pursue a medical degree. But she was successful in doing so. Unfortunately, had a very short career. She died in 1910, actually of complications from tonsillitis. which was one of the reasons that William Minor felt compelled to have his own tonsils removed later in life, which is, of course, the cause of his untimely death. But I think maybe in some way kind of her influence could be felt in William Minor's decision to support Physicians Hospital.
Aptitude runs in that family. All right.
I was wondering, the clinics in Arizona and Florida, do they cover as many medical specialties as the one in Rochester? And are their reputations the same as Rochester?
At the present time, almost all of the specialties. Initially, when they started in 1986 and 1987, I remember I was a fellow and I was training, and I later visited many times because of my job. They progressively built their reputation. Initially, they had very limited services. The hospital in Jacksonville was not a closed staff hospital, and that is a particularity of the Mayo Clinic. All the hospitals today are in Rochester, Jacksonville, Scottsdale, closed staff, meaning they have not allowed outside physicians to join in those hospitals to preserve the culture and the ethos of the medical care. Doesn't mean that the community physicians are less competent, but they wanted a certain culture and a certain, I would say, approach to medical care. So in Jacksonville, they had an open staff hospital that as soon as they could, after a number of years, they became closed staff. They progressively built. With donation, they built a neuroscience center, and they actually had more research and more grants for neurologic degenerative disease in Jacksonville than they had in Rochester. And Scottsdale also developed other skills in the heart transplant, and they did more heart transplant and more heart devices, support heart devices in Scottsdale than they had in Rochester. But for the most part today, they don't have as much training program, but they have training program in all three sites, and they provide, there are some care that they don't provide in the other two sites, but almost all the care they provide. For example, they don't have obstetric and gynecology in Scottsdale. They do have it in Jacksonville. They don't have obstetric, but they have gynecology. In Rochester, they provide all cares. And they did improve over the years. Took decades to feel like they were part of the family. For a while, they were criticized, and that's not unlike other systems. People in Rochester were seeing the financial challenge of the other two sites. Were smaller, were not like us. And they were criticized by physicians and others in Rochester saying they're draining money, they're not like us. It took decades, but now they are very much similar. You're welcome.
Yes.
Thank you. I was quite impressed with your description of the ethos and the culture at the Mayo Clinic. And I was wondering if you think it's possible, and maybe this alludes to some of the discussion earlier about the business side of medicine these days. Is it possible, is it compatible to have that, to promote that kind of ethos and still satisfy the business needs of modern medical care?
I think that it's possible to have, first, strongly think it's possible to have excellence here and other places. There's a reason why the Mayo Clinic became the Mayo Clinic, and it was a series of events. It was the people, it was the location, it was at a time where the country did not have, or did have the right circumstances to lead to this, and the vision of the Mayo father and its two sons. I think that you have excellent care in many other areas of the country, and the Mayo is struggling with the financial side of it as well. The Mayo is looking at its balance sheet. The Mayo can't have everything it wants right away, the physician and people working there. So I think I'm going to say answer your question, the best I can say is that I think it's possible to have excellence. It's probably difficult to exactly reproduce everything that is there, regardless of the size and the volume and the flow of patient. I think it is possible to reproduce the excellence. You don't have to have a huge critical mass, but it is a challenge.
I've asked that question myself many times over the years, and an article that kind of helped me understand it a little bit was in the New Yorker, and it was an article about the inner workings of the New York Times. And what they pointed out was that throughout the New York Times history, the editorial side complained about the business side, and the business side complained about the editorial side. And the business side said the editorial people always want more resources and to say they can do better stories. And yet they try to get across that they're not allowed to print money legally. And I think that we're in a society now where a lot of things have that tension. And I think that it's definitely possible, and in fact, I would expect that ethos and I feel that ethos both should be present and can be present. And I think the key is that both sides have to be talking to each other more than they've traditionally done, probably in healthcare and in other parts of society. So I refuse to give up on the drive for that ethos and the business. I mean, it is hard. I mean, it's interesting. And I learned this through my administrative time. When the hospital said it's getting a new MRI, it's not like it goes in and trades it in and they say, here, take a new one. You actually have to make $1 million to buy an MRI. And that's why it's a business, even though they had to get that through my head a few times. And to keep a place state of the art takes money, and that money has to be, I hate to use the term, the capitalist term, but it's profit has to be used and put back into the business in order to accomplish all that. And it's difficult to do.
I mean, I don't know if I have any particular words of wisdom to add. I mean, not being a helpful kind of doctor, but I mean, I do think it's kind of important to remember that, like business and the economy are not just kind of like nebulous things floating out there. It's, people making particular kinds of decisions, and there is always the option to choose to do things differently if there's, I think, and again, a kind of enough of a critical mass of people who want to see that kind of change.
Couple more questions? Yes, sir.
One for Dr. Deschamps. History, our past history as employees, and we move from one place to another, we tend to bring that history with us. You moved from the Mayo Clinic to UVM just about the time we were beginning to affiliate across the lake and throughout Vermont. Did you bring any things from the Mayo Clinic that's assisting us in this part of the world?
Thank you for asking this. I'd like to think so. Actually, at the time that this wonderful job offer came on my desk, I had been the leader of the integration in the Mayo Health System for the last 2 years. I think this is what got me the job. When I told John Bromstad, the CEO, I've been involved in integration. I believe it can be done. We're doing it at the Mayo Clinic. I really want that job. I think that's what got me. So I brought that belief. That's another type of hope. I could see it working there, and I say, give me a shot at it. And it's not only me, it's give me a shot at the job. And actually, we're making it happen. And of course, it's not me and it's not me alone, but we're making it happen. So I think I brought the belief that it can be done. And it can be done in a number of different ways. The other thing is I was willing to learn. It's a different environment. But really, even if it's a different environment, people want to be treated well. and being able to speak to each other. And I enjoy doing it.
As a retired nurse and massage therapist, I want to appreciate Rich for mentioning William Minor. That I had no idea, and I was grateful for that information. But also, I wanted to ask at the Mayo Clinic, are they doing much with complementary therapies there? Is there a lot of that happening?
More than before. That's interesting. In the years before I left, we were not doing a lot of complementary medicine because they were not being reimbursed by insurance. However, because of some celebrity that came, we started to be interested in it. And there were some scientific trial where we, for example, Dr. Dorini, who was pictured there, who did the heart surgery on the young lady, started a trial where we would have music after heart surgery compared to no music and narcotic for patients that had sternotomy. And we discovered that patients that were able to listen to music after surgery were needing less narcotic. We did massage therapy, same study, same realization that with massage therapy after surgery, we would need less narcotic. And we were not the first to do it. Other in the country did it, and it's being done more and more. So I think it's not a hotbed of alternative or complementary medicine, but it is a place that's open to it, and I saw it happen. Thank you for your question. And we're considering doing it also in Burlington, and I hope that we can do it also in CVPH.
When I was at Albany Medical Center before moving to Plattsburgh, I actually taught the nurses in the open heart surgery nurses to use massage, and they found it very effective. We had a physician come here and speak about it, the stresses of open heart surgery, and mentioned that that was very helpful. So I'm glad you're doing it too.
Thank you for the question. Great. Well, you're losing your voice, so we will probably wrap it up if there are no other questions. Dr. Deschamps, Dr. Frost, Ellen, thank you very much for being on our panel. Thank you, folks, for coming. We appreciate it. Our thanks to Rick Grant and the folks here at Minor Institute for hosting us tonight.